The Pumpkin Giant, by Mary Wilkins Freeman. There are 2 parts in total. This is part 1. A very long time ago, there were no pumpkins. People had never eaten a pumpkin pie, or even stewed pumpkin. And that was the time when the Pumpkin Giant flourished. The majority of the giants were bad and notorious. But the Pumpkin Giant was an uncommonly bad one, and his general appearance and his behavior made one shudder and shake. That was why people called this effect the Giant's Shakes. The Pumpkin Giant was very tall. He had a very large, yellow head, which was also smooth and shiny. His eyes were big and round, and glowed like coals of fire, and you would almost have thought that his head was lit up inside with candles. His mouth, which stretched half around his head, was furnished with rows of pointed teeth, and he was never known to hold it any other way than wide open. The Pumpkin Giant lived in a castle, which was situated on a mountain, with the usual courtyard before it, and a moat full of bones. The Pumpkin Giant was fond of little boys and girls than anything else in the world. But he was somewhat fonder of little boys, and more particularly of fat little boys. The fear and horror of this giant extended over the whole country. Even the king was severely afflicted with the giant's shakes. The king had a daughter, the Princess Ariadne Diana, who was probably the fattest princess in the whole world. The princess was never allowed to leave the palace without a bodyguard of 50 knights, but in spite of all this precaution, the king shook. To the ordinary people, the ravages of the Pumpkin Giant were frightful. There were very few fat little girls, and no fat little boys at all, left in the kingdom. Finally the king, in desperation, issued a proclamation that he would award anyone who should cut off the head of the Pumpkin Giant the honor of knighthood. When the king issued his proclamation, every man in the kingdom who was not already a knight tried to contrive ways and means to kill the Pumpkin Giant. However, they were very frightened, and all of them had the giant's shakes so badly that they could not possibly have held a knife steady enough to cut off the giant's head. There was one man who lived not far from the terrible giant's castle, a poor man, who only had a large potato field and a cottage in front of it. He had a boy of 12, an only son, who was as fat as the princess. He was unable to have a bodyguard for his son, so he became more and more frightened every day. He and his wife had hardly enough to eat, as the fat little boy ate most of the potatoes from their field. The fat boy's name was Aeneas, his father's name was Patroclus, and his mother's Daphne. One morning Patroclus and Aeneas were out in the field digging potatoes, for new potatoes were just in the market. They had a new species of potato, called the young Plantagenet, which was tremendously huge. While they were digging the potatoes, the earth trembled violently. Patroclus and Aeneas looked up and saw the Pumpkin Giant coming with his mouth wide open. "Get behind me, oh my darling son," cried Patroclus. Aeneas obeyed, but it was of no use. The Pumpkin Giant strode along faster and faster, opening his mouth wider and wider. This is the end of part 1.